In the second chapter of the letter that the Apostle Paul writes to congregations in the province of Galatia, he goes really in the middle of that chapter by talking about an event where compromise leads to hypocrisy. We talked previously about the dangers of compromise itself and tampering with the message that actually was given to those early Christians. And the time we have together on this occasion, I really want to talk about chapter 2, and several things are involved in this chapter. At the very end of chapter 1, he makes the statement that after he became a Christian, he did not go to the city of Jerusalem for 3 years. And when he actually visited Jerusalem, he saw Peter and then saw James. He wanted to make sure that what he was proclaiming was something that he hadn't missed any kind of detail in sharing that message with the people. And then in chapter 2 of Galatians, he said that after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and also took Titus with me. And what's involved in these first 10 verses of chapter 2 coincides with something that Luke records in Acts chapter 15. In Acts chapter 15, there's a discussion, actually a disagreement among individuals that are Christians that came out of a Jewish background. I believe that we need to make the Gentile Christians follow the law of Moses in its entirety. The statement's made in verse number 2 of Acts 15 that when Paul and Barnabas had no small dispute with them, the congregation determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders and talk about this problem, which is exactly what they do. And in the course of that meeting, the discussion that ensues, Peter talks about the centurion, Gentile, Cornelius, becoming a Christian. Paul talks about the reception that the Gentiles have made on the journeys that he and Barnabas have participated in, the places that they've gone. And the consensus is, and it should have been an understanding prior to this, that when Jesus is actually giving himself as a sacrifice, it's not just for those of Hebrew descendants, for everyone. And if you go back and read through the teachings of Jesus, Jesus isn't endorsing just the action that was prohibited in the law of Moses. He's heightening that and talking about the attitude. The old law said, don't do this. I'm telling you, don't think about it. But in chapter 2 of Galatians, in verse number 11, after all of this has taken place, when Peter actually comes north from Jerusalem and visits Antioch, Paul says, I withstood him to his face because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, from Jerusalem, Peter would eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. So initially what you have in that meeting in Jerusalem, there's a consistent application. The message of the sacrifice of Jesus, that good news, that gospel, the redemption, the forgiveness, the remission of sins that is found in that sacrifice of Jesus for those that are obedient to that gospel message, is something that carries with it forgiveness without the encumbrance of the law of Moses. You can't make people follow the law of Moses. They're under a new covenant. Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant. So there's a consistency in the way that they apply that message to Jew and Gentile alike, the gospel. However, in verse number 11 and verse number 12, there's a compromising action that leads to alienation. So Peter actually associates with those that are Gentile before certain influential Jews who are Christians come to Antioch from Jerusalem. Then he separates himself. He won't really have any kind of fellowship with them as he did prior to that. That compromising alienation leads to a convoluted or a twisted kind of action. So much so that in verse number 13, the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with Peter, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. Then verse 14, common heads, common mindset, a clear kind of way of thinking. Paul said, when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you being a Jew live in the manner of Gentiles and not as Jews, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews? If you're going to actually act this way around other people, or are you going to force something different on those around you? Twisted kind of action. It's hypocrisy in the way that they are not applying God's word. But the consistent analysis, which exposes that hypocrisy. You can't be one way with one group of people and another way with somebody else. That just doesn't fit. Compromise can be dangerous in and of itself, but when that compromise actually goes into full-blown hypocrisy, and you treat one group of people differently than another group of people, there's no consistency in that whatsoever. Unity cannot exist where that kind of divisiveness is something that is the rule of the day, as it were. Sound familiar? What Paul is dealing with in the hypocritical actions of some individuals that actually have such an influence that they pull other people into that kind of hypocrisy is something in a religious context that we see happening in other areas of our culture. Just look around. Compromise that now develops into full-blown hypocrisy. And the people that are involved in being that, living that kind of hypocritical mindset seemingly do not notice the difference. That's tragic. Someone said a long time ago that there's an overabundance of common sense because very few people in our society use any. Unfortunately, more and more that seems to be the norm rather than the exception. May we be individuals that strive to be consistent with God's Word in everything that we do. And with that in mind, may that consistency spill over into other areas of life where compromising fact is not something that we allow or go along with, but rather something that we expose. When people compromise truth, compromise facts, compromise the message, that very much needs to be exposed, just the way the Apostle Paul exposed the hypocrisy of Peter and those with him. Interesting letter to the churches of Galatia. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.